And you can click on the code of ethics hyperlink there and take a look at the code yourself. Our next topic, and we're going to spend a lot of time here because it's going to be the heaviest lift for all of us. As of tomorrow, consumers are eliminated from real estate transactions. Excuse me, customers are eliminated from real estate transactions, not consumers, customers. So right now within REBA, we know that there's two types of real estate relationships, aren't there? Right in REBA, we've got clients and we've got customers. When we were consulting with the ministry, with the government, they told us that real estate consumers are oftentimes confused about the differences between clients and customers. So the government wants to get rid of that confusion. They want real estate consumers to have a crystal clear understanding of real estate relationships. They want to make this black and white. They want to get rid of that confusion. So here's how they're achieving that. As I mentioned, tomorrow, customers cease to exist, full stop. Clients, on the other hand, will continue to exist exactly the way they do today. The duties and obligations that we owe clients today are the exact same duties and obligations we will owe them tomorrow. But then there's this new animal introduced right into real estate legislation. And that new animal is called self-represented party, or SRP for short. Now, before we go forward, I want to let you know that self-represented party is not just a new name for customer. SRPs and customers are very, very different. So on that note, let's look at how legislation defines an SRP. And it's a very simple definition. An SRP is simply a party who is not a client of any brokerage. Very simple, isn't it? They're simply not clients. Now, remember when I mentioned that SRP is not a new name for customer, that SRPs and customers are very different? Let's take a look at one of those huge differences. So right now, today, under REBA, the brokerage can enter into written agreements with customers, right? We can do that today in REBA. Beginning tomorrow, the brokerage is not permitted to enter into written agreements with anyone other than a client, which means the brokerage cannot enter into written agreements with SRPs the way the brokerage can today with customers. So you may wonder, well, what does that really mean, Ray? What does that mean for me? So let me use an example. Let's say I'm working with a buyer client today, and that buyer client expresses an interest in a for sale by owner. So on behalf of my buyer client, I'll approach that FSBO and I'll say, can I show your home to my buyer client? And if I sell it, will you pay me? Right? We do that. And oftentimes those FSBOs say, sure, if you can net me what I want in my pocket, I'll pay you. And that FSBO is not a client, are they? FSBOs are truly self-represented parties. But I can get paid by that FSBO directly today, can't I? Or the brokerage can, right? And how do I get paid from that FSBO, that self-represented party today? I have them sign an agreement. Most commonly, we have that FSBO, that self-represented party today, sign the AREA customer service agreement for a property not listed for sale. That's how we collect payment, isn't it? But remember, I just mentioned that beginning tomorrow, the brokerage cannot enter into written agreements with anyone other than a client. So do you see the ramifications of that? We can no longer get paid by a FSBO. We can no longer get paid directly from self-represented parties. That's a huge shift, isn't it? Why, you ask? Why, Ray, did the government do this? Why can we not just ask self-represented parties to sign an agreement to pay us? Remember when I said the government wants to eliminate the confusion that exists today between customers and clients? The reason that the government does not want us to enter into written agreements with SRPs goes to that very principled approach they're taking to making sure that consumers truly understand real estate relationships. And the government believes that if we allow self-represented parties to sign agreements, even if it's just to pay us, that in fact could lead that self-represented party to believe that they are a client, to believe that they are receiving services from us. So to eliminate that confusion, to make this black and white, we cannot enter into written agreements with SRPs. So I know some of you are going to ask me, well, how in the world do we get paid in that particular example, Ray? Well, we all know that we can get paid directly by the buyer pursuant to the terms of a buyer representation agreement, can't we? We can ask the buyer to pay us for our services. But remember, I've been a realtor for 28 years. I'm still a practicing realtor. I'm in the trenches with you each and every day. I know that it's not always reasonable. I know that it's not always possible to get paid directly from the buyer pursuant to that BRA. That always won't work, will it? First-time home buyers in particular, they've only got 5% skin in the game. They don't have thousands of extra dollars to pay our fees, do they? So relying upon that BRA is not always possible. OREA has another solution. OREA is recommending that you ask that FSBO, in my particular example, to sign a listing agreement for the provision of one service. Just one service. And that service is the presentation of an offer. That is to say, you ask a self-represented party, a FSBO, you thinking of my example, to enter into what I like to call a mini listing agreement. And the services on that listing agreement are reduced to simply the presentation of an offer. Will FSBO sign that? And if they do you see what happens? This is key. When that FSBO, who is a self-represented party, ends up signing that mini listing agreement, they become a client, don't they? And when that FSBO, when that self-represented seller becomes a client, and we've got a buyer client in connection with the same transaction, now what do we have? We now have multiple representation, don't we? Remember off the top, guys, I said I hear a lot of things said on social media about TRESA that aren't true. One of the things that I hear that's not accurate is that multiple representation has been banned. It hasn't. Multiple representation is alive and well. You have to practice it by the rules of multiple representation, just like you have to now. But multiple representation has not been banned. So I hope that helps you understand how significant of a difference it is between SRPs and customers. Now, on this note, I want to introduce directly from TRESA, directly from the legislation, what we can actually do with an SRP. Like, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What can we do with an SRP? So TRESA has a two-step process right in the legislation that tells us what we can do for an SRP. Here's the first part of that two-part process. The first part says you can help an SRP if that help is an actual service to a client of the brokerage. Let me say that again. You can help an SRP if that help is an actual service to a client of the brokerage. And notice that I use the word help. That's very deliberate. That's all we're permitted to do with an SRP. We can't provide them services. We're only allowed to help them if that help is an actual service to a client of our brokerage. So if you're wondering, what does that really mean, Ray? Let me roll out an example here. So let's say there's a buyer out there who wants to be a self-represented party. They proclaim themselves as a self-represented party. They bought 10 houses before. They tell you that they have the knowledge to do this on their own. So they're truly a self-represented party. Yet that self-represented buyer wants to look at a property that my brokerage has listed for sale. So my question is, can I show that self-represented buyer my brokerage's listing? Well, of course I can. Showing my brokerage's listing is in fact a service to my seller client. That's what's meant by any help that you give to an SRP must be a service to an actual client of the brokerage. But that's only the first part. Now we've got to look at the second part. This is a little bit gray, guys, but I promise I'm going to bring it home for you on the coming slides. The second part of this two-step process says any help that you give to an SRP must not use your skill or your judgment. Well, what is your skill and your judgment? Well, that's your opinions, that's your advice, that's your services, isn't it? So in an effort to try to help you understand what not able to use your skill and judgment means, let's think of that self-represented buyer example again. That self-represented buyer wanted to look at my brokerage's listing. So as a service to my seller client, I showed my seller client's home. And then after the self-represented buyer looks at the home, she says, Ray, I love it. I want to buy it. But before I make an offer, I need you to help me better understand market value here. I need you to help me better understand what's a reasonable offer to make. To do that, Ray, I need you to prepare a CMA for me. So my question to you is this: can I prepare that CMA for that self-represented buyer? So what do we have to do? We have to think back to that two-step process about what we can do for self-represented parties. So let's look at the first part. Any help I give to a self-represented party must be a service to a client of the brokerage. So yeah, I guess I could argue that doing that CMA in an effort to get an offer on the table would be a service to my actual client. So I think so far, so good. Let's look at the second part. The second part says any help that you give to an SRP must not use your skill or your judgment. Let me ask you this. Is selecting sold listings, is picking listings that have sold from the MLS that are truly comparable to the subject property, requiring us to use our skill or our judgment? It is, isn't it? So therefore, the answer is no. In that particular example, I cannot prepare that CMA for that self-represented buyer because doing so uses my skill or my judgment. I'm going to come back to this two-step process in a few minutes. But for now, I want to answer for you what you need to do before you provide any help to a self-represented party. There's some steps you have to take before you give any assistance to an SRP. First, you're required to provide that SRP with that new document. That's our next topic, the information guide. But because the information guide isn't unique to SRPs, it's for all real estate consumers, SRPs, and clients. We're going to have a further discussion in a few minutes about that info guide. But the first thing you're required to do is give the SRP the information guide and explain it to them. The second new form that you need to become familiar with, which you have to present to that SRP, is called the information and disclosure to self-represented party. Both the information guide and the information and disclosure form must be authored by Rico. Aria, who creates all those wonderful forms that we use in our day-to-day businesses, listing agreements, BRAs, etc., will not be creating either the information guide or the information and disclosure to self-represented party. Why? Because as I said, the legislation says Rico must be the author, and we have to use the Rico version because TRESA says so. So on that note, let's have a look at what's on the SRP acknowledgement form. First, the form itself is a disclosure. That's all it is. It discloses to the individual who chooses to be self-represented that the brokerage, in fact, has a client in connection with this transaction. And oh, by the way, that's not you. That's not you because you decided to be self-represented. We, in fact, represent the other party in connection with this transaction as a client. And that's not you. It's a bold statement that you're not our client. And then the form, according to TRESA, must explain to the self-represented party the significant risks that they're undertaking when they choose not to be a client, when they choose to be self-represented. It lets them know you have to be able to stomach these risks of going it alone. And then the form explains to the self-represented party the type of help we're able to give to them. Now, if that statement from TRESA leads you to believe we're going to get a list of the types of activities in which we can help an SRP, it's not like that. You already know what this is. We already discussed it on the prior slide. The help that we're able to give them, which they're advised of on this form, says, we're only helping you because it's an actual service to a client of our brokerage. And oh, by the way, any help we give to you must not use our skill or our judgment. And then TRESA requires that this form recommend to the self-represented party that they in fact get independent professional advice. Now, I know you all automatically think that that means lawyers, right? And that's one type of independent professional advice. But it's more than that. Independent professional advice could also be another real estate brokerage. This could mean you should become a client of another real estate brokerage. The decision to buy or sell real estate is such a significant one, you should actually be represented. Now, let me be clear. Just because this form recommends to the party to get independent professional advice doesn't mean they have to. The legislation can't force them to get independent professional advice if they don't want to. This is no different than when we recommend to buyers today to get home inspections and they say thanks, but no thanks. SRPs can say thanks, but no thanks to this particular recommendation. And then lastly, after you review this information and disclosure form with the SRP, you've got to ask them to sign it. All right, so by way of summary, before you provide any help to an SRP, you're going to review the information guide with them and this particular information and disclosure form. And if you guys would like to have a look at this form, if you haven't already done so, it's available on RECO's website. That is reco.on.ca. This document is a 2-pager. The second page is basically for signatures. So have a look at it on the RECO website. So in an effort to make sure you fully understand the differences between being a customer and self-represented, let's go through these few questions. And the first one is this: can I show another brokerage's listing to a self-represented buyer? So to answer that question, we have to think back to that 2-step process, don't we? And what's the first part of that 2-step process? Any help that you give to an SRP must be as a service to a client of the brokerage. We've already got our answer, don't we? Another brokerage's listing is not our seller client, right? So therefore, the answer to question 1 is no. You cannot show another brokerage's listing to a self-represented buyer. Let's look at number 2, and I'm going to elaborate on this one. So let's say a buyer chooses to be self-represented, inquires about one of my brokerage's listings, and wants to have a look at it. So naturally, as a service to my seller client, I'm going to show the self-represented buyer my brokerage's listing, my seller client's listing. And then when the self-represented buyer looks at it, she says, Ray, I love it. I want to buy it. Let's go back to your office right now and let's write up an offer. I need you to help me write up an offer. So my question is this: as a service to my seller client, do I help the self-represented buyer write that agreement of purchase and sale to make sure that the offer for my seller client is airtight and bulletproof? And when I do this presentation in person, about 50% of the room say, yes, as a service to the seller client, you write up that offer for the SRP buyer. And the other 50% say, no, you shouldn't. Let's walk through that 2-step process one more time to answer this question. The first part is any help you give to an SRP must be a service to an actual client. Well, so far, so good again, right? Writing up an offer is no doubt a service to our client, in this case, the seller client. Let's look at the second part. Any help that you give to an SRP must not use your skill or judgment. To answer that, let me ask you this. is selecting conditions, is selecting clauses, is recommending conditions and clauses to a buyer, in fact, relying upon our skill or our judgment? It is, isn't it? So therefore, the answer is no. You cannot write up an agreement of purchase and sale. You cannot recommend conditions and clauses to a self-represented buyer because that, in fact, relies upon your skill and your judgment. Let's look at number 3. By way of example, let's pretend I just listed a brand new property today. And I planted the for sale sign in the front yard. I return to the office and I receive a telephone call from a prospective buyer. I don't know this buyer. I've never met this buyer. Therefore, this buyer is not my client, right? And so the buyer's asking me questions about my new listing. And when I let the buyer know the asking price, the buyer says, stop right there, Ray. It's more money than I can afford. That's $200,000 outside of my budget. But I know, as a realtor in that community, there's 2 other houses for sale on the same street that are lesser priced, that are in fact within this buyer's budget. But guess what? They're listed for sale with another real estate brokerage. Now remember, this is a cold lead. This is not my client. I've never met this buyer before. And also remember, we've all just learned that we cannot show another brokerage's listing to a self-represented buyer. So does that mean I cannot show this cold lead, these other listings offered for sale by other brokerages? That's not the expectation of TRESA. The expectation is that those former customers who we could have showed another brokerage's listings to today become clients. That is to say, we can show another brokerage's listings to buyer clients. Now, I know some of you are thinking right now, but Ray, I hate the hard sell. Ray, I hate asking buyers to sign a buyer representation agreement before I take them out and show them properties. Ray, I instead prefer to build relationships with buyers before I present them with that BRA and ask them to sign a contract. I prefer to build those relationships, take the buyers out, show them a few properties to get them to learn to trust me before I present them with that contract to commit to me. And when I make this presentation in person, 80 or 90% of everyone in the classroom says that's how we do it. We prefer to build relationships with buyers before we ask them to sign that BRA. The reason I mention all of this is to make sure you're aware that you can create agency other than in writing. It's called implied agency, isn't it? Or implied representation. Remember when we learned all about that in our registration education? For some of us, it was years ago, 28 years ago for me. But implied agency allows you to build client relationships other than in writing. That is to say, by the things you say and the things you do. We do it all the time today. When we answer questions from buyers today before they sign a BRA and our answers involve opinions or advice, we're creating implied agency. We do that today. And TRESA allows us to continue to do that beginning tomorrow. Implied agency is defined right in TRESA. Now look, I understand it's textbook best practice. I understand that it's the gold standard to get a buyer representation agreement signed before you let a buyer smell the leather in your vehicle. But I also know, because I'm in the trenches with you every day, that the vast majority of us prefer to build relationships before we ask the buyer to sign that contract. And we can continue to do that. So it might work something like this. This is just one example of many. When that buyer who called about my brokerage's listing says, Ray, it's too much for me, that I'm only pre-approved to a certain amount. Your listing is $200,000 more than I can afford. And I know that there's 2 other properties available for sale on the same street that are lesser priced. I may say something like this. There's a couple of other properties available for sale on the same street that are lesser priced that might be of interest to you. Can I tell you about them? And if that buyer's sincere She's going to say yes, isn't she? And then I'm going to say to that buyer, as a service to you, I can provide you with a list of sold properties from the last 90 days that have taken place in the neighborhood. This service to you will help you better understand current market value. Would you like me to send you sold data? And as realtors, we know buyers love sold data, don't they? They crave it. So what's that buyer going to say to that offer of receiving sold info from me as a service? Yes, Ray, I want that. And then the third thing I'm going to say in this example is, when I find you a property that you fall in love with and you want to buy, are you able to write your own real estate contracts? And what's a buyer going to say to that? No, I don't know how to do that, Ray. I need you to do that. Why did I say all those questions? Why did I ask all those three questions? I did that to get an answer from this prospective buyer to receive services from me. And the buyer agreed to receive services from me. I now have implied agency. I now have a client on my hands. But I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to send that buyer an email. And what's that email going to contain? Well, the first paragraph is going to say, here are those properties that I mentioned to you that are currently available for sale that might be of interest to you. Would you like to have a look at them tomorrow afternoon? If so, what time? Then the second paragraph is going to say, as per your request, I've attached here too a summary of those properties that have sold in the neighborhood within the last 90 days. This service is to help you better understand current market value. And then the third thing I'm going to say in that email, and this is a tease to our next topic, which will in fact help you comply with another new part of the legislation, in which I say, here's a link to some information about real estate that we're going to discuss when we meet for the very first time. So by way of summary, agency can be created other than in writing. Agency can be created by the things you say and do. That's called implied agency. Now, again, I want to repeat, if you can get a BRA signed at the earliest practical opportunity, that is before you take a buyer out, don't change what you're doing. That's fantastic practice. Keep doing it. If you want to know more information about implied representation, RICO just released a great bulletin on it. Go to rico.on.ca, go to their bulletins link and download the implied representation guide. So on that note, guys, let's do a quick summary of self-representation. So remember, tomorrow, no more customers in real estate. They cease to exist, full stop. You're either a client of the brokerage or you're a nobody. And if you choose to be self-represented, I can help you, but that help is only because it's an actual service to a client of my brokerage. And oh, by the way, any help that I give to you will not rely on my skill or my judgment. So I'm sure by now you guys fully appreciate that self-represented party is not a new name for customers, is it? And then remember, you can no longer enter into written agreements between the brokerage and clients. That is to say, we cannot enter into written agreements between the brokerage and SRPs, meaning we cannot collect remuneration directly from SRPs the way we could customers. Our next topic is about disclosures, consents, and acknowledgements. Let's zero in on disclosures. So within REBA, we know there's lots of disclosures. Those same disclosures exist within TRESA. There's 3 new requirements that you need to be aware of. The first is that in the case of a disclosure, there must be prominent placement of the word disclosure. Well, let's look at the disclosure document on your screen. You see AREA Form 160 on your screen. This is the registrant disclosure of interest, isn't it? This is the form we're required to sign along with our broker of record when we're attempting to purchase property. Does this particular document satisfy that requirement in TRESA? That is prominent placement of the word disclosure. It does, doesn't it? You see the word disclosure in the title of the document in a big bold font and in a font size that's larger than any other font throughout the document. So that's done. The second new obligation is that when you make a disclosure, the disclosure itself must be written in plain language that's clear and concise. So if I'm going to disclose a latent defect to you of a basement that leaks every spring in a spring thaw, that's what I'm going to say. Each and every one of you just understood what I said, didn't you? The basement leaks every spring in a spring thaw. I didn't sound like a structural engineer there, did I? That's how you're going to word it in your disclosure document, just like I did there. And lastly, when you make a disclosure, it must be presented in a way that brings attention to the information that is required to be conveyed. So again, let's look at the disclosure document on the screen. Is there a lot of blank space on that screen where if I type something in a bolded font, it will jump off the screen to the attention of the reader? There is, isn't there? So right there, this form satisfies that new requirement that the disclosure be presented in a way that catches the reader's attention. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. AREA will make sure that our disclosure forms, like the one on the screen, comply with prominent placement of the word disclosure and comply with the requirement that disclosures be attention drawing. All we have to remember is that when we make an actual disclosure, we have to do it in plain language. Not a heavy lift there, is it? I do want to talk about the timing of the disclosure of multiple rep, however. So the disclosure requirement of multiple rep is not anything new, is it? We do that now. We disclose multiple representation to clients today, I think, using the confirmation of cooperation and representation, right? Here's what's got to be different beginning tomorrow. And this is with regard to the timing. The timing becomes of critical importance. Here's how this has to roll out. When the brokerage realizes that it's approaching multiple representation, the brokerage has to slam on the brakes and not take any further steps on behalf of any of the parties, any of the clients who find themselves in multiple representation until the parties have been made aware that this is multiple rep. They've been made aware of what multiple representation looks like, and they consent to proceed in writing. We do those things now, don't we? With regards to the disclosure and the signing. We do that on the confirmation, as we all agreed. But remember what I said has to be different here, and that's the timing. So let's look at a real life example. Let's say I list a property for sale today, and you and I work at the same brokerage, ABC Realty. And when I list the property for sale today on behalf of the brokerage, the seller says to me, Ray, I do not want to entertain any offers until 5 days from now. I don't even want to entertain a bully offer. The seller signs AREA's seller's direction to give me that lawful instruction. The seller initials the no conveyance oval on that seller's direction, which means no bullies, right? So today, when I list the property for sale, you show it to a buyer. And when your buyer's looking at the property at the conclusion of the showing, your buyer turns to you and says, I love it. I think I want to buy it. I think I'm going to make an offer. I'm going to go home, have dinner, and I'm going to think this one over during dinner. Right then and there, when that buyer expresses interest to you, you've got an indication right there of multiple representation. Right then and there, you have to slam on the brakes and say to that buyer, this is multiple representation. This is what multiple representation looks like. Are you cool with that? And if that buyer says, yeah, I'm okay with that, I understand what you've said, then I need that buyer's consent to proceed. Do you see how different that is versus the way we do it today? This buyer hasn't signed an offer yet. And generally, we're getting that confirmation signed along with the offer, aren't we? But in my example, we have to stop everything at that expression of interest and get these forms completed for the disclosure of multiple rep. And AREA's created some new forms to help you in that process. They're called Forms 325 and 326. On your screen, you can see the multiple representation, seller acknowledgement, and consent form. So at that moment, when multiple representation is created, You have this form filled out and you get your client to fill it out or sign it rather. Now, the form I have on the screen is for a seller, but the buyer's version is exactly the same, except instead of seller, it says buyer. So in my example, you're going to have that buyer sign form 326 to consent to proceed in multiple rep. And in my example, you as the buyer's agent, when you know our brokerage is in multiple rep and I listed the property for sale on behalf of the brokerage, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to reach out to me and say, Ray, my buyer's thinking about making an offer. Ray, that means we're in multiple rep. You need to tell your seller. And what am I going to have to do? At that point, I'm going to have to reach out to the seller and say, hey, a buyer from our brokerage has expressed interest in your property. That means this is multiple rep. This is what multiple rep looks like. Are you still okay with that? And if the seller says, yeah, I'm okay with that, what do I got to do? Get the seller's consent to proceed. So really, there's nothing new here other than the timing, right? That's it. As soon as multiple representation is created, even from a prospective client, we have to disclose it and get consent to proceed. The next thing we're going to talk about, this is our third topic, is the information guide. I'm sure you have all looked at it on the RECO website. The advanced copy is up there for all of us to see. With regards to the information guide, you only have two things you need to do. That's it. Only two things. The first thing is you've got to give a copy of the information guide to all consumers. In the case of a client, before you provide them any services. In the case of an SRP, before you provide them with any help. So give a copy of the information guide to all real estate consumers as soon as possible. That's the first part. The second part is you've got to review it with them. Now, that doesn't mean read it word for word, but you have to walk them through what's in the guide and ask them if they have any questions. Those are your only two obligations. Did I say that TRESA requires how you provide a copy of the guide to consumers? I didn't, did I? So if you want to send a copy of the information guide in an email as a PDF, that's cool. If you want to print this thing off and give them a hard copy, that's okay too. Remember when I sent that email to that buyer in a prior example where I said, here's a link to some information about real estate? That link was to the information guide. See how quickly and easily I got rid of my obligation to give a copy of the guide to a consumer at the earliest practical opportunity? That was easy, wasn't it? The only other thing I have to do, as I said I would do in my email, I'm going to review it with you when I meet you for the very first time. Did I say that the TRESA regulations require that consumers acknowledge that you gave them a copy of the guide and that you reviewed it with them? I didn't, did I? There's no requirement in TRESA to get that acknowledgement. Now, is that a best practice that a lot of brokerages are adopting? It is. We don't want to be in a situation where it's a he said, she said, where a client says, Ray never gave me a copy of the guide or reviewed it with me. So I'm in fact going to get an acknowledgement. I'm going to get a signature that I gave you this guide and reviewed it with you. RECO, on the last page of the information guide, does in fact have a signature section. You can ask consumers to sign the information guide on the RECO provided version. OREA, on its Working with a Realtor form, has a new initial section right on the Working with a Realtor form. You can ask buyers and sellers to initial that they received a copy of the guide and you reviewed it with them. So by way of summary, all you got to do is give them a copy of the guide and review it with them. Now, here's what the legislation says needs to be in the guide. We'll go through this really quickly, guys, because now that it's available on the RECO website, I would encourage you to read it, review it, and get familiar with it. But here's what the legislation says needs to be in the guide. First, it's all the benefits of being a client of a brokerage. And then it goes on to say, here's all the duties and obligations that the brokerage owes to you when you become a client. And then this is a two-way street. It reminds consumers that become clients that they in fact have obligations to the brokerage. When a seller signs a listing agreement, they have an obligation to pay, don't they? When a buyer signs a BRA, they have an obligation to refer any inquiries about any property whatsoever to the brokerage. They're reminded of that. And then here it is, guys. There's a lot of information in the correctly named information guide about all of the risks of being self-represented. There's lots of examples. There's lots of examples provided to consumers about those risks of not being a client. And guess what one of those risks identified is? We cannot help you fill out real estate documents. So when you tell an SRP you can't help them write an offer, it's not going to be a shock to them. They've already learned about that in the information guide. And they've already heard about those risks when they signed the RECO information and disclosure form. They've already heard it twice. I would encourage you to read the information guide risks so that you know what the risks are that SRPs have to be able to stomach. And then there's a laser focus in the information guide on some of the things that consumers should be paying attention to in those written agreements, being the BRA and the listing agreement. The first thing is the expiry date. Clients are told, know what you're signing, read what you're signing, know the length of the agreement. Why is the expiry date a laser focus in this guide? It's due to the volume of complaints where clients say, I didn't know I signed a listing agreement for 12 months. I only thought I signed it for 3 months. And now I learned that it's a whole year. I don't want to be with this brokerage for a whole year. So consumers are told, look, read the expiry date, know what you're signing. And then the expectation is that there be termination language in written agreements in those circumstances where we do allow a client to cancel the agreement. That does not mean you have to agree to termination provisions. That's up to you. But if you do in fact agree to allow a client for whatever reason to cancel their BRA or listing agreement, that agreement must be captured in the respective contract. And then clients are advised to look at the scope of the agreement. Well, what's that mean? Well, the scope of a BRA refers to the geographic location identified in the BRA. Buyers are told, know the geographic location that you're committing to. And again, this is in response to the complaints where buyers say, I didn't know I signed a BRA for the entire Southwestern Ontario area of the province. I thought I was only signing a BRA for the town of Port Dover. So clients are advised, read and know what you're signing. And then there's a statement in the guide that advises consumers, which we all do already anyways, that remuneration is not a set standard, that it's entirely negotiable between the brokerage and its clients. And then we're going to talk about designated representation at the conclusion of today's presentation, but it does become a reality tomorrow. However, consumers are told that if they enter into designated representation agreements and their designated rep has to go away or gets sick, that the client must agree to a new assigned designated rep. And when I say must agree, I mean that the brokerage can't arbitrarily assign somebody else. The brokerage can recommend somebody else and the client can say yes or no. But if the client says, no, I don't want any other designated rep other than Ray, and I'm going away, that client's contract can be canceled by the client. And then there's 2 pages of information provided to consumers about what multiple representation looks like, how there are limitations to services provided in multiple rep. And it even says to clients, you do not have to agree to multiple rep. And then lastly, the guide says to consumers, hey, if you have a concern in a real estate transaction, reach out to the brokerage management. Like reach out and try to solve your concerns with the brokerage management before you file a complaint with the regulator. That is RECO. And if you can't, here's how to file a complaint with RECO. So as I mentioned, guys, all this info is in the info guide at reco.on.ca. Beginning tomorrow, we've got to start providing all of our consumers with a copy of the info guide and explain it to them. So if you haven't already wrapped your minds around what's in the guide, you better do it this afternoon. The next thing is TRESA has given RECO's discipline committee greater strength. So right now in REBA, the discipline committee has the authority to issue a monetary penalty and or make you take continuing education. That's their only authority. The registrar, on the other hand, has the authority to suspend, revoke, or apply conditions to your registration. As of tomorrow, the discipline committee itself has that same authority as the registrar. That is, the discipline committee too will be able to suspend, apply conditions to, or revoke your registration. Right now, the discipline committee composition, the size of it is 3 members. As of tomorrow, that increases to 5 or more members. And one of those 5 must have no connection whatsoever to the real estate industry. And right now, if you're ever found negligent by the discipline committee and you think they got it wrong, you can appeal. And appeals will be heard by RECO's appeals committee. Starting tomorrow, those appeals will be heard by an independent quasi-judicial tribunal. That is the Licenses Appeals Tribunal. And the regulator gets new power and tools beginning tomorrow. Some of you might find this hard to believe, but currently the regulator, that is RECO, does not have the authority to look into a registrant's conduct unless there's a formal complaint. That changes tomorrow. If the regulator suspects negligent behavior on your behalf, they don't have to wait for a formal complaint. They can launch their own investigation and they can refer a complaint to the discipline committee. The next thing is RECO's going to be able to post additional information about registrants on the RECO website. So as you guys are probably aware, if you're ever found negligent by the discipline committee, the hearing results will be posted by your name on the RECO website. Beginning tomorrow, if there's even just a proposal that your registration be suspended, have conditions applied to it or revoked, that proposal will be posted on the website. You haven't been found negligent yet. There's just an allegation issued against you that's resulting in a recommended revocation of your registration, suspension of your registration, or have conditions applied to it. That mere proposal will be put on the site as a warning to consumers. And lastly, this is only for brokers of record and brokerage management. RECO has a new authority beginning tomorrow, and that is they can reach out to the brokerage and collect transactional data. Now, what kind of transactional data they're looking for, I'm not sure. I'm sure it'll be something like how many transactions have you participated in the preceding time period. However, whatever it is, when RECO knocks, I'm going to deliver as a broker of record because the law says I have to. Our next topic is a new option for sellers when they're selling their properties. So right now, under REBA, when there's a bidding war, we have an obligation to tell all buyers who submit a written offer the number of offers they're competing against. That obligation doesn't change. That remains the same. But what is new beginning tomorrow is that the barrier to sharing the contents of competing offers is removed. That is to say, a seller can direct you as their listing agent to share the contents of competing offers with other buyers, something we currently can't do. This is only an option. Sellers don't have to share if they don't want to. They can still conduct a blind bidding process if they so choose, but it's entirely up to the seller. But here's what you need to know. There's no rules. There's no lane that the seller has to pick. And by that, I mean, the seller doesn't have to tell prior to offers being received whether or not they're going to share the terms of competing offers. They can do whatever they want whenever they want. And that's what I mean. They don't have to pick a lane. So imagine this. I'm a listing agent. I call you. You're a buyer's agent. You've submitted an offer on behalf of a buyer. And I say to you, there's 10 written offers for the seller's consideration. We're presenting them tonight at 7. And you say to me, hey, Ray, is the seller going to share the terms of any of these offers? And I say to you, no, she said she's not. She's going to conduct a blind bidding process because she believes that's how she's going to get the most amount of money for her property. So you and your buyer proceed on that basis. So I go ahead and I present all 10 offers. And then when I'm done presenting the offers, the seller turns to me and says, Ray, I want you to tell everybody that the best offer I received was for $2 million. Am I going to have some ticked off buyers and some ticked off buyers agents? I am, aren't I? I told you that the seller was going to conduct a blind bidding process. And then she shared the contents of competing offers. But did I do anything wrong as the listing agent? I didn't, did I? Because the regulations don't require the seller to pick a lane. So here's what we need to start doing with our buyer clients beginning tomorrow. Obviously, we need to educate them about this new option for sellers, don't we? They're not going to know about it. And then when we're representing a buyer during a bidding war, I think we need to ask them this key question. I think we literally need to ask our buyer clients in a bidding war, how would you feel if the seller shared the terms of your offer with other buyers? Like, that's literally the question. How do you feel about that process? And you're no doubt going to have some buyers who say, you know what, I just want to try to buy the property. I don't want to rock the boat. I'm going to put my best foot forward. Let's roll the dice and let the chips fall where they may. Right? Some buyers are going to be that relaxed about it. But we're also going to have buyers who say, no way do I want the terms of my offer shared. No way do I want somebody to know my proposed purchase price so that they can try to offer more than me. We're going to have both kinds, aren't we? Both kinds of buyers. So what are we going to do when we're working with a buyer who doesn't want the terms of their offer shared? Is there anything we can do? REA has created a new clause, just one new clause this year. And I don't have it verbatim with me. It's available on the REA website in the standard forms section, but really the intention of the clause is this. It puts pressure on the seller not to share the terms of the buyer's offer, because if the seller does, the offer becomes null and void. You see the intent there? It puts pressure on the seller not to share the terms of that particular buyer's offer, because if so, it will become null and void. So while the seller doesn't have to pick a lane, that is whether or not they're going to conduct a blind bidding process or share the terms of competing offers, there's 3 rules about what they can and can't disclose. The first rule is this. The seller has to tell all buyers who submitted a written offer the same information if they do disclose information from an offer or offers. By that, I mean, if a seller receives 5 written offers, the seller can't say, I didn't like 2 of those 5. I only liked 3 of those 5. 2 of them weren't even close. I don't want you to share this information with those 2. I only want you to share it with those 3. You can't do that. You have to share it with all 5 buyers because TRESA says so. Rule number 2 says that it's entirely up to the seller how little or how much information they share from an offer. The legislation doesn't say you can only share or you have to share A, B, and C. It's entirely up to the seller what they disclose. Some sellers might just disclose the price. Some might disclose the price and the closing date. Some might disclose the price and the fact that there were no conditions. It's entirely up to the seller, except, and this is the 3rd rule, they can't disclose any information that would reveal the personal identity of the buyer. What would that be? Well, the buyer's name, clearly. And if the buyer had a house to sell, we wouldn't want to disclose the address of the buyer's house to sell because we as realtors could figure out quite easily who the buyer was simply from their address, right? So there's this new option, guys, beginning tomorrow for sellers. The barrier to sharing the contents of competing offers is removed. Our second from last topic is with regards to the contents of written agreements. Written agreements meaning the buyer representation and the listing agreement. So here's what TRESA's expectations are. That any written agreement must clearly, must comprehensively, and prominently set out the following. In the case of a listing agreement, remuneration payable to any other brokerage. Now, I know you guys are thinking, Ray, the REA listing agreement already does that. There's a blank for total remuneration. There's a blank for the portion of the total remuneration offered to cooperating brokers. And you're right. But that's not the spirit of this particular regulation. What this means is that it's entirely up to the seller. It is the seller's decision as to the size, as to the amount of the cooperating broker's remuneration payable. It's not our decision as the brokerage. It's the seller's decision. So it could work something like this. I could say to a seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, the fees for my services are 5 apples. Of those 5 apples, I propose offering 2.5 of those apples to cooperating brokers on the MLS. How does that sound to you? And if the seller says, Ray, that's okay, we're good to go. However, if the seller says, you know what, Ray, it's a tough market out there. I think we need to offer more. I think we need to offer 3 of those 5 apples to cooperating brokers on the MLS. To which I can say yes, or I can say no. But if I say no and the seller doesn't agree, my only option is to decline that listing, right? My point here is this. It's the seller's decision as to the size of the cooperating broker's remuneration payable. The next thing is this. The agreements must clearly identify any circumstances in which remuneration payable may change. Well, what does that mean? Have you guys ever had a seller that says, hey, Ray, if you list it and sell it, that is, you double end it, will you do it for a point less? Sellers ask us that all the time, don't they? So if I do in fact agree to 1 point less, if I double end it, I've got to capture that in the listing agreement. It can't be verbal. It can't be a handshake. Now, because of the introduction of self-represented parties write-in legislation, you may have sellers that say, Ray, if you just help an SRP buyer and their lawyer writes the agreement of purchase and sale for them, we don't think you're entitled to the full freight contracted for. We don't think you're entitled to the full 5 apples. We think you're only entitled to the listing broker's portion of the remuneration. We don't think you're entitled to the cooperating broker's remuneration. Again, to which I can say yes or I can say no. But if I say, okay, yes, I agree to different remuneration, if I simply help an SRP, it can't be verbal. It can't be a handshake. What am I going to do? I'm going to slap a Schedule A on that listing agreement and capture that agreement. The next one is a big one. The expectation of RECO is that the services that the brokerage provides pursuant to a written agreement be clear, comprehensible, and prominent. So let's focus on a listing agreement as an example. So if I say to a seller, I'm going to post your listing on the MLS in 24 hours, I'm going to pay for professional photos, and I'll host an open house once a month until it's sold, the expectation is that I clearly, comprehensively, and prominently outline those services in the listing agreement. How am I going to do that? Again, I'm going to put a Schedule A on the listing agreement outlining those services. Our current listing agreement as of today has a marketing section, but it says something like the seller authorizes us to market their property for sale however we see fit during current market conditions, right? As of tomorrow, the expectation of RECO is that we outline those services. And remember when I talked about the information guide and the possibility of clients asking the ability to terminate? Well, if we do agree to a circumstance in which they're permitted to terminate the BRA or the listing, again, it can't be verbal, it can't be a handshake. We put it in the written agreement. And lastly, today we have to have clients initial the expiry date when the length of the agreement is 6 months or longer, right? Beginning tomorrow, they initial that expiry no matter what it is, no matter the term. 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, always has to be initialed. And lastly, designated rep. Remember off the top, I said this is something OREA has been lobbying for since 2017. Tomorrow it becomes a reality. So what is it? Designated representation allows a real estate brokerage, when it has more than one client in connection with the same trade, to designate a different agent to fully represent each client without the limitations of multiple rep. So I know that's a mouthful. So what does that mean? So again, by way of example, let's say you and I work together at the same brokerage, ABC Realty, and I list a property for sale on behalf of the brokerage today under brokerage representation. And you're working with a buyer. Remember, we both work at ABC Realty, and your buyer submits an offer on the brokerage's listing. Because the brokerage represents both the seller and the buyer, what do we have? We have multiple representation, don't we? And we know that when we have multiple representation, both the buyer and seller, as per my example, receive reduced services, don't they? We can't talk to the buyer or seller about anything pertaining to money or motivation because the brokerage is in fact in a conflict of interest situation because the buyer and seller have competing interests. This is multiple rep 101, right? We all know this stuff. But what happens in multiple rep is that our clients, in fact, receive reduced services. So in my example, when your buyer says to you, what should I offer on raised listing? You can't answer that because it's a conflict of interest situation for the brokerage. That changes tomorrow if your brokerage adopts designated rep. Here's how. The brokerage will allow you to appoint yourself with the seller's consent in the case of a listing agreement to be the designated representative of the seller. You and only you are the designated rep of the seller. The rest of us who work with you at ABC Realty, we are not representatives of the seller anymore the way we are under brokerage representation. I'm the only designated rep for the seller. The rest of you at the brokerage have to be impartial to that seller. Likewise, again, you and I work together at ABC Realty. You have a buyer client who signs a buyer representation agreement tomorrow. And the buyer representation agreement designates you as the designated rep for the buyer. That means you are the designated rep. You are the only agent for the buyer. The rest of us who work with you at the brokerage, we are not a representative of the buyer like we would be today. So your buyer makes an offer on my seller client's listing, and we work at ABC Realty together. If that's designated representation, multiple representation no longer exists. That conflict of interest is removed because I'm the representative and the only representative for the seller. You're the representative and the only representative of the buyer. And in that particular example, if the buyer says to you in designated rep, what should I offer on raised listing? You can answer it because we don't have that conflict of interest situation any longer. Is this not consistent with consumer expectations? It is, isn't it? Consumers expect when they hire us as their representative that we're going to be always able to give them advice and opinions. They don't want to be subject to the limitations of multiple rep. I mean, they roll with it when it happens, but it doesn't mean they love it. Right? Now, if you do practice designated representation, you as the agent are responsible for safeguarding the confidential information of your client. So if I list a property for sale and I'm the designated rep for a seller client, I have to safeguard my seller client's confidential information. So if I know that the seller is selling their house because they bought another house that's closing in 90 days firm, and they really need this thing to be sold and closed within 90 days, I can't broadcast that around the office the way I actually could under brokerage rep. Because remember, under brokerage rep, we are all representatives of that seller. That's what I mean by safeguarding the confidential information of your respective clients. Now, guys, we have the best of both worlds here in Ontario. AREA lobbied long and hard to make sure that consumer choice was alive and well, even within designated rep. I think we're the only province who practices designated rep beginning tomorrow that actually achieved this. And when I woke up to this news one morning from the government, I was like a kid in a candy store. I couldn't believe our lobbying efforts actually achieved this. Here it is. Jump to bullet point number 5. We've already talked about the others. Multiple representation can still exist even within designated representation agreements if the clients agree in writing. So what does that mean? Well, let me put it this way. Let's say I'm a buyer, I'm moving to your city, and I've known you for 20 long years. You've helped me buy and sell real estate over the course of the last 20 years. So I reach out to you and I say, I'm moving to your city. Help me find a new house to buy. And so we go out and look at houses, and then I fall in love with my dream house. I love it. I want to buy it. But guess what? The house that I fell in love with, the house that I want to buy, you have listed. You're the designated representative for the seller. If multiple representation were not permitted in this particular type of example, you would have to say to me, sorry, pal, even though I've known you for 20 years, I can't help you. To which I'd say, pardon? I've known you for 20 years. We've done business together lots of times over the years. I know you. I like you. I trust you. I know you have my back. You've never let me down before. To which you would have to say, sorry, pal, the government banned multiple rep. But that's not what the government did. They said multiple representation can exist, even in designated representation, if the parties agree. So what you're going to have to do for me in our particular example is say, Ray, because I have this property listed for sale and I'm a designated rep for the seller, this would be multiple representation. That means the services that I can provide to you are limited this way. Are you cool with that? And if I say, yeah, I'm okay with that, because I know you have my back, I trust you, I know you're going to be honest, then I consent to proceed in writing. And you're going to have to likewise have that same conversation with the seller. And if the seller says, yes, I'm okay with that, you can in fact represent the seller as the designated rep and me as the buyer, although that's multiple rep. Okay, so let's summarize what takes effect tomorrow. New code of ethics, 2 pages long. Customers cease to exist, full stop. You're either a client of the brokerage or you're a nobody. And if you choose to be self-represented, I can help you, but only because that help is an actual service to my client. But oh, by the way, any help that I give to you will not use my skill or my judgment. And if you still insist on being self-represented, I'm going to review with you that self-represented form, that information and disclosure to self-represented party form authored by RICO. And remember, we've got those 3 little new requirements when it comes to disclosure. REA forms are going to make sure those disclosures comply with TRESA. And then we've got to give every single consumer a copy of the information guide and explain it to them. And we talked in great detail about this new option for sellers when they receive offers on their property in a bidding war. And then we just wrapped up a discussion of designated rep. Now, we don't have a lot of time left together, and we're not going to get to all of your questions, as I previously mentioned. And you're going to have questions, as I said, tonight, tomorrow, next week, next year. I want to let you know how OREA has your back, how those questions do not go unanswered. Remember OREA.com/TRESA. I've got it on the screen for you again. Here's why that is your one-stop shop for all things TRESA. On that website, we have a video series called TRESA in 2. We call it TRESA in 2 because none of those videos are longer than 2 minutes in length. They're down and dirty, they're raw and real. I would encourage you to watch those videos even after you watch today's presentation, because Angie and Marg say things and explain things and use different examples differently. You'll learn something from them too. If there's any gray areas, check out those videos. We also have a frequently asked questions page on this website. As we receive questions from members around the province about TRESA, we answer them right on the website. Some of the questions that you want to ask or will have in the future are already answered there. Check it out. And then my favorite part of the website is this, the reach out section. If you click on that get in touch hyperlink on the screen, you just input your name, your email address, and fire off your questions. And OREA will answer your question. We've been really good at answering most questions within 24 hours. The volume of requests is through the roof right now, so we're having a challenging time keeping up with that 24-hour turnaround. But please know, we will answer all questions. So on that note, that wraps up those 8 key changes that come into effect tomorrow. I'm going to turn things over to, I think, Julia from OREA, who's been monitoring the Q&A, and she's going to ask me some of your questions. So over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Ray, for another great presentation. Most of the questions came in about self-represented parties, so I'm going to start with those.
Okay.
So we can get through the most frequently asked, and then we'll move on to some more miscellaneous questions. So the first one is, if a person calls and wants to see my brokerage's listing, are they automatically an SRP?
Yeah, so when somebody inquires about a property, or walks into an open house as another example. They are neither a self-represented party or a client until they make that decision, or until you do something that that provides your opinions or your advice, or you offer services. So a lot of people believe that when somebody just asks you questions about real estate, they're automatically an SRP. They're neither until they engage forward in a real estate transaction. So the question was, Julia, if they want to look at a property offered for sale by the brokerage, I think it's fair that you've got to give them information in the information guide. You've got to give them the information guide, which is going to explain to them the different relationships that are available to them. And they've got to make a decision. If you proceed and provide them with service, you give them opinions or advice, you've got a client on your hands.
Thank you. Can we refer an SRP out to a different brokerage for a referral fee?
Yeah, look, I don't have the answer 100% certain. I am concerned that recommending another real estate brokerage, referring an SRP to another real estate brokerage is probably not permitted, because you're going to refer that SRP to another real estate brokerage for the right reason. And the right reason is that because that other brokerage is good at what they do. You used your skill and your judgment to make that recommendation. And further, you would be collecting a referral fee, most likely. I think that's the nature of the question. So check back to AREA's FAQs, because I know that's one of the questions that we're currently posting to the website once we get clarification. Right now, I don't think I'd do it until we clarify on the FAQ section for you.
And we have our listing clients consent to disclosure in our listing agreement that we are authorized to also represent buyers for any offers on their properties, instead of having to go back and get their consent for each potential client that may want us to help them offer on our listing.
Yeah, the simple answer is no. The legislation is very time specific. It says you must get the written consent when multiple rep is created, not before. You can't ask clients to agree to something before it's created. So the answer is no.
When trying to get a seller as a client, part of the interview process is to go over marketing and provide an evaluation of the seller's property. Does this not go against the rules because the prospective seller is considered an SRP?
Yeah, so right now, in that particular example, again, that prospective seller is neither an SRP nor are they a client. They're a consumer just getting information at that point. And I had that exact same question. I asked the regulator that exact same question. And the response was that information that you're providing, a potential asking price for their home, is only information at that point. I agree with you. Getting that information uses our skill and our judgment. But because at that point, that information we're providing is not in respect to a trade, it's permitted. And we have actually answered that question on our FAQs with a link back to a bulletin in which the regulator answered that exact question. So check our FAQ page to link back to the RICO answer on that particular question. But it's business as usual when it comes to providing CMAs when we're in a listing competition.
Will SRPs be able to list on MLS?
No, they can't. To list on MLS, you must be a client of a brokerage.
So under TRESA, you can now only be a client or an SRP. Does a limited service agreement not make someone a client? And if so, do we not have fiduciary duties to that client, even if the only service we offer is presenting an offer to them?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As I mentioned during the presentation, when that consumer turns client by signing an agreement, we do have multiple representation. And you, as you rightly stated, have to treat that individual as a client.
If we list a property and an SRP puts an offer themselves, what will happen to co-op commission?
Yeah, so that's a decision that you should be making with the seller at the time you list the property for sale. It's fair game to say to a seller at the time you list a property for sale, my remuneration, my fee for services is this much, no matter the circumstances. If I double end it, my fee is my fee. If I help an SRP, my fee is my fee. Now, on the other hand, you may say, I will charge only the listing brokerage portion if I simply help an SRP. That decision is between you and the seller at the time you list the property for sale. But if the question really is, are SRP buyers entitled to the remuneration? No, they're not. They're not registrants. And as you know, the brokerage can only pay registrants in connection with a trade. They are not entitled to it. Those conversations have to happen when you list the property for sale.
What happens if a prospective buyer seeks advice and opinions and they establish implied agency, but then decides after that they're going to self-represent after the agent's done all the work and the BRA has not been signed? So wouldn't all SRPs do this without repercussions?
Yeah, look, we have that situation today where we work with consumers in the absence of a BRA, and then they do something dumb and they go use another agent to write up the offer. We don't have a leg to stand on to get paid, do we? The only way that we're guaranteed to get paid in a situation like that when we're showing properties to a buyer is to, in fact, have them sign that BRA. With regards to the concern about the buyer flipping later saying I'm self-represented and they bring their own offer, look, there's nothing saying that they're going to get anything in terms of that remuneration. You're still entitled to your remuneration.
Okay, I'm going to move on from SRP so we can give the other topics a chance to get answered here. So for designated representation, someone asked, if I'm a designated representative for the seller, does that mean I can never double end a deal?
No, remember what I said in closing when we talked about that discussion of multiple representation still being alive and well. If you have a seller client pursuant to a listing agreement, that's a designated representation listing agreement, and a buyer signs a BRA and you're appointed the designated representative for that buyer, and both the buyer and seller say, yeah, it's okay if you represent us both, you can do that. You can double end it as the question was, but you have multiple rep and you have to disclose the multiple rep and you have to get consent to proceed in writing. So you can still double end if you make those necessary disclosures and get written consent.
Okay, now regarding disclosures, can a seller disclose different parts from different offers, or do they have to disclose the same components of each offer if they direct the agent to share contents of the offer?
Good question, but the seller can share different terms from different offers. They don't have to always share the same terms. It's whatever the seller wants, as little or as much from any of the offers, and it does not have to be the same.
Okay, can we email properties to buyers that we are not representing?
Yeah, for sure. So that is just considered information at that point. Sending listing information is not in respect to a trade. Now, if the buyer receives that email and calls you about a particular property and asks you questions about that property that would require your opinions or your advice, then you're creating implied agency by the way you answer that question. When you give opinions, when you give advice, that creates implied agency. So there's that very fine line between providing information and then giving information and advice. And you've always got to make sure you understand when you've crossed that line.
Okay, thank you, Ray, for answering all of those questions. That's all we have time for today. But please make sure to visit aria.com/TRESA. We have a lot of information and resources on there for the members. And also remember that this session will be recorded and uploaded to the website tomorrow, so you can review the information there as well.
Good luck, guys. Have fun tomorrow. Happy 'twas the night before TRESA.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you again, Ray.